I'm very pleased to have you here today. We've got quite an interesting program today. Today is a follow-up from the event we did in, I think it was November, around carbon footprinting, looking at scopes 1 and 2, a little bit of 3. So obviously we've had some feedback from people around their first attempts around carbon footprinting, and there's an opportunity to do some more. And also we've got some interesting stuff about scope 3. And if you're like me, and you've just started thinking about your scope 3, then it's probably looking quite daunting. So hopefully today we'll sort that out for you. Just before we start, we will be doing some feedback from you throughout the day. And my computer has decided it doesn't want to play now. There we go. So if you've got a phone handy, you can hold it up to the QR code and it'll take you to a feedback form that you can fill in as we go. I also wanted to mention about some events we've got coming up in the near future for the rest of our program. The University of Winchester are doing an event around the B Corp movement. So that's not a Sustainable Business Network event, but is a very interesting topic, aimed more at the larger organisations, but can be useful for smaller ones who are looking very much at that sort of social impact side of their business. So a very useful way of structuring your examination of your sort of social impact right across your supply chain, in both directions really, in customers and suppliers, and also what you're doing obviously with your own staff. So yeah, a very useful standard, that one. And then the next Sustainable Business Network for Winchester event is on packaging and sort of recycling and plastics, which is in May. And then at the end of June, we haven't quite fixed the date yet, but round about the last week of June, we'll be doing an actual in-person live event on sustainable transport and active travel and movement and that sort of stuff. And that will be at the University of Winchester, where we hope to have sort of demonstration vehicles of sort of fleet vehicles. So the University of Winchester will have their sort of electric van fleet, and also some sort of electric cars and options for active travel in terms of electric bicycles, scooters, and those sorts of things. So we can talk about pros and cons of some of these different forms of treatment and how we're going to move people around in the future. And then the North Hampshire SBN are also looking at sustainable transport, but from a slightly different angle. I haven't got a date for that yet, but they'll be looking at the sort of finance and how you afford these things, which I think will be quite interesting. So before this event, we sent out a form asking you for your feedback and your some ideas and problems you might have had with your carbon footprint. And if you haven't had a chance to fill that in, again, we've got another QR code, and hopefully Wendy will pop the link in the chat if that's easier. So you can go to that form now and tell us any problems you might have had forming your carbon footprint. If you haven't started, what's stopping you, or if you have started and you got stuck, what are your problems? And we'll try and answer those issues in the chat section that's coming up.
Okay, so good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for joining the SBN event. So I'm looking to just deliver a bit of a legal update to give an idea of the different types of legislation that have sort of arrived on the scene since we last met. I'm really trying to capture a flavour of some different types of legislation as well. So we've got some different topics within here. So we'll just start with the first one, which is plastic packaging tax. So this links to one of the next SBN events. We'll be focusing much more on this. So there'll be more information, but just to kind of give a bit of an overview on this. The purpose behind this taxation scheme is to put in place an economic incentive for businesses to use recycled plastics in the manufacture of plastic packaging. We obviously know there are huge environmental impacts and consequences from using plastic packaging. So really, this is about trying to create greater demand for recycled plastics. And in turn, that should then stimulate greater levels of recycling and collection of plastic waste, which would ultimately mean that it's not being diverted into landfill or incineration. So this will apply to packaging that is classed as plastics and recycled plastics that doesn't contain at least 30% of recycled plastic. And so packaging would be considered to be classed as plastic packaging if, when measured by weight, it's the greater sort of source component of that plastic packaging than any other substance, because obviously we get packaging that's made up of lots of different materials. So if the plastic part of that is the greatest weight, then it is technically classed as plastic packaging. So it'll apply to anything that's that doesn't contain at least 30% recycled plastic. So that comes into effect from the 1st of April 2022, and that will be affecting UK manufacturers of plastic packaging, importers of plastic packaging, and business consumers of and manufacturers of importers of packaging. So it applies at the point that you import 10 tonnes or more of packaging in a 1-year period. And essentially, if you do that, then you'll have to pay a rate of £200 per tonne. So you'd be sort of registered into a scheme where you'd be sort of filing returns on sort of the amount of plastic packaging that you're manufacturing or importing. So this is really designed to kind of shift that environmental impact of plastic packaging, and encourage and sort of provide that incentive to generate more recycled plastics. Another piece of legislation that we've been expecting for quite some time is based around the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure. And essentially, this is about requiring companies to report their climate-related risks and opportunities. We obviously understand that there's a huge array of different climate change impacts and potentially opportunities that could be faced, and these are very specific to individual organisations. So this piece of regulation has been brought out to initially to target much larger companies, so typically listed companies, those are greater than 500 employees or £500 million turnover, to start actively reporting and disclosing what they're doing around addressing climate change impacts to their business. And there is an equivalent piece of legislation as well for limited liability partnerships. So essentially what this covers is that there has to be disclosure within their annual reports around what governance processes they have for assessing climate risks and opportunities. So how these are assessed within the organisation, how that's cascaded into their overall risk management processes. And importantly, they need to highlight the specific climate change risks and opportunities that apply to their company, and also how those risks would change over time. As we sort of know, climate change impacts will gradually get worse and worse. So what you have to do as part of this regulation is assess these impacts under a range of different scenarios and see what the relative impacts would be. So within that, you would then set sort of actions around how you would address risks and how you would aim to try and realise opportunities, and how you would then set targets and performance indicators to monitor progress towards these over time. So whilst this might not apply directly to a number of the businesses that will be on this call, the TCFD framework for looking at climate-related financial disclosure is a really good framework and guidance recommendations to adopt if you're thinking about firstly understanding a process for how to assess climate risks on your business, but also if you're looking for some good practice guidance on the type of information that you could provide around what you're doing. So that TCFD report is a really good sort of source of sort of guidance on how to go about doing this. Something a bit different, and again linked to one of the later SBN events around electric vehicles and charging infrastructure. The electric vehicle smart charge point regulations are coming into force from the end of June. And so what these do is set out smart charging requirements for new electric vehicle charging points, specifically for homes and workplaces. So it doesn't include public charge points. There's sort of separate regulations that apply to those. And really, this is about ensuring that those charge points are designed to be effective and efficient in terms of their energy consumption. Because there are obviously a number of challenges with the amount of new electric vehicle charge points that are being brought onto the grid. And there are concerns around how that would impact the grid capacity, and how things like a lot of people charging their cars at similar sort of times might create surges in the grid. So some of the key requirements that really relate to energy efficiency around this is firstly around data and connectivity. So all new charge points have got to have a data connection, and they've got to have the ability to measure, record and transmit information, and particularly about energy. But also there's sort of a requirement around off-peak charging and delayed charging. So the kind of key part of this is that there is a lot of demand in the national grid at key parts of the day. So particularly 8 till 11 o'clock in the mornings and 4 to 10 p.m. on the weekends. So what this is designed to do is to try to minimise the impact of a lot of additional load going onto the grid from electric vehicle charging. So one of the things that happens through this is that there is a randomly deferred charging start time. So when you plug something in, it means it doesn't necessarily start on the hour, as with everyone might be doing it. So it might kind of start on the hour. It delays it by 10 minutes or sometime between 10 minutes. So there's a bit more of a staggered, start to people's electric vehicle charging when they're plugging it in, where you would typically sort of set the charge time for, 10 till 2 on your app. It then might delay it by 10 minutes randomly to try and sort of stagger that flow of grid capacity. So it's really trying to make sure that the grid isn't put under unnecessary stress, and to manage the fact that there's going to be a lot more additional electric vehicle charging infrastructure coming along line in the next few years. Now, this is quite an interesting one. So there's been additional guidance provided on making environmental claims. This is something we see happening an awful lot more now around different products and services, process brands or businesses making environmental claims. And an environmental claim might be that something has a positive environmental impact, no impact on the environment. It's less damaging than something that's previously existed. So it might be a replacement product or service, or is less damaging than someone else's goods or services. So some guidance has been published on how you would go about making sure that an environmental claim is correct. And it's important to remember, I suppose, that with making an environmental claim, it doesn't necessarily need to be something that you would be directly stating as an environmental benefit. It could be anything that's indicated or inferred through an advertisement, marketing material, branding, or packaging. And that can even come down to things like the colors, the pictures, and the logos that are used, and the overall presentation of a product and service. So claims are genuine when they properly describe the product or service and don't hide or misrepresent critical information. So this guidance has been produced by the Competition and Markets Authority to help businesses to comply with that requirement and make sure that they're not misrepresenting any environmental claims. And it sets out some general principles which are fairly sensible around being truthful and accurate, clear and unambiguous, mustn't hide or misrepresent information, needs to be fair, needs to consider the full life cycle of the product or service. I think that's a really key part that this guidance is looking to address, so that it's not just focused on a part of a life cycle that might be better. It's actually considering the full sort of life cycle of a product or service. So to help with that, and if this is something that you'd be interested in looking at, there is a green claims code checklist. And then there is also a sort of a more basic presentation around the principles of the green environmental claims that you can review, and we'll put in the links to the presentation. So this is quite interesting, just to it's clearly become an issue that there's been a lot of misrepresentation around environmental claims. This guidance needs to be created to help sort of minimize that risk. So there's also been an update to bans on different types of F-gases that are used in new products and equipment. So F-gases typically have a high global warming potential, which just basically means that they're really damaging and contribute towards climate change. So there are a series of gases that are being phased out from use. So there are some additional gases that have been introduced into that listing for being banned from 2022. So that includes those sort of HFCs that will be used in refrigerators and freezers for commercial uses. And again, this is about new products and equipment. So this is largely if you're in a manufacturing sort of setting, these gases are being banned. As well, just for kind of wider context on this as well, it's not just about things that you would typically expect to sort of see refrigerants in, but there's also things like bans on F-gases in heat pumps. And heat pumps, of course, are part of our sort of overall solution to the decarbonisation of heat in buildings. But obviously, you need to make sure that if you're putting in something as a sort of low energy, measure to support net zero carbon, that you're also considering the type of F-gases that are embedded into those items of equipment as well. So that's really what this is designed to do. So just in terms of a couple of consultations, really just to give an indication of future legislation and updates that might come out. The first one is on mandatory digital waste tracking. So the waste industry in the UK has really evolved massively over the last sort of 30 years, and it's become quite fragmented with different systems in place around the transport, management, and description of waste. And what that means, it's really difficult to actually trace waste from sort of source creation to end disposal. And the compliance process along that is also quite fragmented, with a large part of the sort of waste tracking process being paper-based. Now, obviously, there's been a lot of changes over the last few years, particularly around COVID, and there's been a lot of sort of COVID-specific exemptions around the need to supply and provide paper-based audit trails. And so really what this consultation is looking on is how that paper-based race record system could be replaced with a digital version. So that is a consultation that's live from January to April. So if you still wanted to feed into that consultation, it's open for another month or so. And it's really designed to digitally capture that waste tracking from origin through to final disposal. And one thing it does kind of make clear is that the process for bin collections for household waste won't change. But as part of this, householders could be provided with a unique identifier to allow people to see actually what happens to their waste. And this will be a key part around the kind of education around people's understanding of how waste is treated, and therefore start to influence their behaviour on how they treat waste and try to segregate waste and enhance recycling. Another, again, completely different type of consultation is around biodiversity net gain regulations. So the Environment Act 2021 outlined a mandate for the implementation of biodiversity net gain. And essentially what that means is that when development is undertaken, that there is an improvement or extension of natural habitats, i.e. the environment's left in a better state after a development than it was before the development. So it's really around kind of net gain. So this consultation is really looking at the kind of practical ways of how would you actually implement that process for development activity. So looking at sort of how you would do that on-site and off-site, what the market is like for biodiversity audits, because obviously you need to be able to assess what was in place prior and afterwards, and how you measure that, how you quantify it, how you would then start to layer in principles around additionality. And additionality is a really key concept that we see embedded in a lot of environmental legislation, and it's really about making sure that sort of claims around net gain are genuine, and it's not really claiming for things that have already happened or would otherwise happen through other mechanisms as part of the development. So it's creating additional net gain. But also, around some of the practical parts of the process around how you report, evaluate, and monitor sort of the overall kind of net gain process. So again, that consultation opened in January. It's open till April if you are looking to, sort of respond into that. I think just one last slide, just briefly, but I think this is kind of linked to a wider point around environmental legislation. There's obviously a huge amount of legislation aimed at energy efficiency, things like ESOS and streamlined energy carbon reporting. But also, as we know at the moment, there is a very significant energy crisis going on, and a lot of concern around the future of energy prices. So just as a last tool that you can utilise, for SMEs, you can access the Emphasis CO2 reduction project, which can provide a free energy efficiency audit that can be provided to help your business work towards a low carbon future. But it's also proved a really useful tool for the organisations that receive that to kind of help with their compliance as well with environmental legislation, and just really start to bring some of that knowledge, skills and awareness into the business. So if anyone would be interested in that, I'll drop my details into the chat after this, and any other questions, of course, on any of the legislation that we've covered, I'd be very happy to get in touch with you. So I think that is bang on time for 9:20. So thank you very much.
That was perfect. Thank you very much, Pete. Yeah, so if anyone's got any questions for Pete now around anything he's just said, then do pop those in the chat. I have one myself, actually, just on the packaging legislation. You mentioned it applying to people who import packaging. Does that apply to people like retailers, or is that people who are importing packaging to then fill it and sell it on to somebody else?
Yeah, it's a really good question, because there is, for a lot of packaging regulations, it kind of cascades down. There's sort of a value chain of people who are sort of primary producers, people who might manipulate packaging into another format from an original type, cardboard into a cardboard box, people that might fill it. So it kind of cascades down that chain. And ultimately, it can actually end up affecting consumers in terms of that price being passed on. The overall economic impact assessment of that piece of legislation was that it should have pretty marginal impact to consumers. So yeah, there's a sort of a variety of different ways in which that would be kind of enacted through the value chain.
Okay, thank you. We have had one question pop up in the chat from Michelle. She just want to know whether your audits are available nationwide, or are they just in the sort of Solent emphasis region?
Yeah, absolutely. So Michelle, perhaps I'll pass on the details of the eligibility for the emphasis team, and they can sort of confirm all that with you. But essentially, yes, it can be sort of anywhere in England, really.
If there's no other, oh no, Wendy's popped up with her hand
Just
up.
to add another comment on that, with funding there for SMEs, from the North Hampshire session that we did a couple of weeks ago, Locase, which is low carbon action in the southeast, were presenting there about different packages there for a low energy capex projects. So that's Locase, LOCASE. So you can check that out in the video links that we'll put with us as well. And that goes more, I think that does go quite wide. And also the speakers referred to nationwide programs for other grants as well. So hopefully that answers your question, Michelle.
Okay, and another one just popped up from Sam. Business based in Chepstow, which is southeast Wales. Are these England, or is it truly national?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'll put that through to the team, because we're sort of we've got sort of specific boundaries that we're able to provide that in, but it's kind of a case by case. So if I can contact Sam regarding that, then I will do that. Put you in touch with the team.
Okay, thank you very much. So if we've got no other questions for Pete, I'll say thank you to Pete, and we'll now. Oh, hang on, no. Oh, last minute, someone's popped in alternatives to F gases. Oh, cool. That's not my area of expertise. I know. I mean, you're right. There are devices that use carbon dioxide and ammonia. Does anybody from the team know any more about those?
And Duncan, just to chip in, you're absolutely right there. I would love to say more. I used to work for BOC gases. It was a little while ago, but there are a lot of drop-in replacements for some of the nastier F gases that are there. Some of them are a little bit expensive, but some quick Googles onto some sites. I have to say, have a look at BOC's site, but also have a look at their other brands are available, their competitors as well, and you'll get the latest on what's available and pricings on those.
Yeah, we were looking at air source heat pumps a while ago, and we did discuss ammonia as the refrigerant gas, which is great because it has a global warming potential of 3 or something, which is fantastic. But they were pricey. They were more expensive than your standard refrigerant ones. But I guess that's another thing where the price will come down. And someone just mentioned systems using water. That is clever. Okay, so we've moved on. It's 9:25 now, so we'll move on to discussing our carbon footprinting points. So at this point, as well as our speakers today, we'd also like to introduce Abby and Xenia from Ridge, who are part of the steering committee for this group, but also have some expertise in carbon footprinting alongside the likes of Carbon Footprint, obviously Miles and Wendy, and Matt, who's been doing theirs from the University of Winchester. So if all those people would like to unmute and pop their cameras on. Roll. Good morning, everyone.
Hopefully these numbers will change as we're going through here. We can see that the majority of you that have filled in, really pleased to say, look at that. That's really good. The majority of you have had a go at doing your carbon footprint, which is excellent. And for those of you that have done your carbon footprint, this is the bit where we asked, what did you find your challenges were? And look at this, some of you are finding you didn't really have any challenge at all. You bright and wonderful things. This is very good. Then we broke this down into the series of challenges really related to data collection here against electricity. Okay, we're seeing a few of those. And we go on for gas usage. Here's vehicle fuel coming through. Here's a big one, expensed cars. That one tending to be a bit difficult. I know that for some people that exists in HR and some in finance, and that brings its own problems. A collection of different things in here. We might come back to that in a moment. Interesting split there. Let's keep going down in interest of time. If you have measured, what did you use to calculate your footprint? I think we can all read off here what we've been using, the most popular being using your own good old MS Excel spreadsheet. So we're all keen on filling in base factors and so on and so forth from there. Some of you using the little tool provided by Duncan last time. That's good to see. And other facilities there that are available. Just moving across there, we have using consulting services, because I know some of them are quite difficult to do, and we've got another other that we might want to unpick in a bit. Let's just keep it easy for a moment and look at those of you who haven't measured your footprint yet. This is what this looks like. Okay, so maybe I might need to hover just so you can see what these things say. The biggest one here. Okay, we might have to jump into other in a second. Biggest. Just going through really things that tend to relate here to time pressures and ease of doing the footprint. Okay, so that's sort of the big picture that we're getting, and I think I want to dive into this section here. Before we had the extra respondents in there, let's see if we can unpick that a bit. Okay, jump in. We might need to jump into the right. This could be interesting because it's changing all the time. What we were seeing within here before the session was quite a lot of comment on scope 3 coming through. So I'm just going to have a quick look through and see what's been added to that.
But just while Wendy's searching for that, so we had a few comments there about people struggling with finding their data. I'd be interested to see what sort of issues they had. But perhaps any of the team would like to talk about how they've sort of sourced their data and any recommendations they might have. When you pop a hand up, Matt, you look like you're trying to say something.
Well, specifically on the scope 3 side of things, for us, it's been really difficult, which is probably something I'll touch on in my presentation, but certainly getting the quality of data in the right format has been a real challenge, and that's something that we're going to be working on for a significant period of time, I would say.
Oh yeah. I mean, in terms of the scopes 1 and 2, I mean, there were comments there about transport fuel data, and particularly from expenses, and I can certainly relate to that. I do manage to get expense data on travel from finance, but it's very vague. People will put in a claim and it will say, I went to a meeting, and you're like, well, where? How far was it? You know. And you can work out the mileage because they get paid a certain amount per mile, but you've no idea if they did that in a mini or a tank, you know. So it's like, what's your fuel consumption and all those sorts of things. What we started doing, what I tried to do last year, well, there was very little travel last year, was I started getting people to do an actual travel diary. So it says, you know, I went to Manchester and I was driving, at least whether I was driving a petrol or a diesel car is a good start, and ideally a small, medium or large car. And that's started to give me a bit more granularity. And if they haven't gone by car, then you can get quite a lot more detail, because people will then put in, I went by bus to the station that was 2 miles, and then I took the train to London, and then I took the underground. And you know, actually now I've got a diary of broken down journeys where you can start getting some reasonable detail. Finding out what the carbon footprint of a 2 mile underground journey is a bit more tricky, but you've got a lot of detail there if you can get people to do a diary rather than relying on your expense data.
And I think, Duncan, that's a really important part of it, because if you engage with your staff and tell them why you're doing it, they're much more likely to want to be a part of it. So it's having that conversation, isn't it? So we've been looking at, obviously, as a big company, we've got a big carbon footprint and we want to really explore that. So we're engaging with everybody and helping them be part of the solution. So then they actually want to come to you with what's going on. So they're part of that opportunity, I guess, as well.
Absolutely, yeah. And there are pretty much everybody is aware of their carbon footprint now, even though they don't know what it is, and they know they'd like to do something. but they don't necessarily know what to do, or and particularly with business travel, what's your business policy? They don't know whether they'd be justified in taking a bit longer to get somewhere because they're going to go by public transport, so they're going to get a bus and a train and another bus, and so they know it's going to take them longer than if they just drove from A to B, and they worry that the boss might not be okay with that they're taking 2 hours for a meeting that could have only taken an hour. So having that conversation with your staff and letting them know that it's okay to take a bit longer is very important.
Maybe bring in a competitive element. So we've got a few different offices around the UK, so we're going to get a bit of a competition going to see who can get their carbon footprint the lowest, and just try and bring a little bit more dynamic to it to make it something that people actually engage with as well. We've had quite a lot of success rolling out environmental champions, so getting the young people around the offices to really take everyone to task on it, essentially, which has been a really interesting experience as well. So
yeah. Also, there was people there having trouble with things like electricity data. I know that's a particular problem for tenants who don't necessarily have access to meter readings and stuff. I don't know if any of the consultancy firms have got some solutions to that. Any luck with talking to landlords about how you get people that data?
Yeah, so we often recommend discussing directly with the landlords, trying to get, even if you can't get your exact kilowatt hours, looking at potentially the building's kilowatt hours and working out an apportioning ratio, so looking at the meters squared or the amount of people, or the more granular you can get, the better. So if you can get on a floor area, you can use that. And then in worst case scenario, for like a first year, if the landlord's not available, sometimes we'll use factors such as SIBSI factors, and they have a lot of granular detail on the type of office, type of business. And then you can look at electricity or gas usage per meter squared. So that's a way you can do it, and that's typically an annual factor.
That sounds quite helpful. There's a few things going on in the chat at the moment. People suggesting some sources of data and things, which I don't necessarily understand all of.
Actually, can I pick up on one point there on actually commuting footprint and its best buddy homework footprint? I've just seen the note on there, and yes, I mean those are probably two of the newer footprints that come about during the pandemic, because a missing part of a footprint. And I actually had I've got someone emailed me anonymously off form here asking, saying I'm completely lost on homework footprint. I know it's there. How do I do it? And the way to do that, and also on the commuting footprint, because when you've done that side of things, you need to balance it up with the commuting footprint as well. And there are some ways there, and yeah, just to bring that point up.
Thank you very much. Somebody in the chat there mentioning climatic as a source. I might go and look that one up. That sounds interesting. And dig that one up. Have you had any luck digging into the spreadsheet?
Yeah, I mean the scope 3 and fear of scope 3 is coming up a lot, awful lot, and combinations of those other factors of, yes, I'm struggling with not having enough electricity and not having enough gas. So sometimes it was a multi-choice on here, but the combinations of those things coming through, and I think we've said quite a few useful things here, and just to go perhaps back on the homework and the commuting footprint. Again, in some of those last SBN sessions, we've tackled that with a methodology for doing that. So we'll post that in the links after, so you can check out the methodology to do homework footprint that we have covered, which is a good one. Okay, shall we go down the page then, Duncan, in interest of time here? Right. I think that one there, in terms of what people, that's not really for us to comment on. I was saying I'm really pleased people using a range of different things depending on their levels of skills really there. I think it would be interesting to tackle this one about reasons for not measuring your footprint now, and those barriers. So, again, others is a bit of a combination of things above, but here, can we tackle this, please, panel?
Yeah, time is something, that we all struggle with inevitably, and particularly in the smaller businesses. Particularly, it's quite handy as a small business where you're not regulated in terms of producing a carbon footprint, that you can take as long as you like. So if you've got your own spreadsheet, it is quite easy to do a bit and then put it to one side and come back to it next month. So that's one of the advantages of not being regulated. You don't have a deadline that you've got to get it in for. But yeah, it can be a time-consuming process, particularly if you're struggling to get hold of the data to then assemble your carbon footprint. Once you've got a process of, if you've got meter readings, it obviously makes life easier. You've got a process for obtaining your travel footprint, which is always the bit that takes the longest in my case. If you've got those processes and the data becomes more readily available, then the whole process is shortened. But yeah, it can be time consuming. Does anyone have any tips on how to do it quicker?
I definitely recommend just looking at the options you've got there. Some of the online tools you can use now are very easy and quick to use. You can jump in and out of them. Typically, they'll save your progress. So that's definitely a good one. And then obviously, you have the consultancy services. We're one ourselves. We provide sort of help if you don't have time. Obviously, there's a cost involved, but yeah, that can help with providing sort of packs to help you collect data and doing the calculations on your behalf. So between the two, they're quite good if you're looking at if you're struggling with time there.
Mm-hmm.
Can I just add into that? The first year's the worst. It gets loads better. And I think Duncan's kind of anticipated that, of actually getting your teams ready to know that they need that data. And Duncan's spot on. If you can be gathering month on month your data, it makes it much less worse, if that makes sense, at end of month 12 to get the final piece of data, and you'll know the consistency of it. Waiting until the 12th, well, it's the 12th month, 12th hour to get all the data sometimes is kind of really difficult. But know who you've got to contact. Is it HR? Is it finance? What are you going to be asking? And perhaps you can make it easier. And what is required for SECR is obviously reporting aligned to the financial year. Even if you're not doing that, it probably makes sense to measure over the financial year, because that's where finance will have the data. There's nothing they like least than having to pull data across 2 financial years. So it just makes it a bit easier asking people for help.
Absolutely, yeah. There's also a comment from someone who says it looks too difficult, and I've had similar discussions to this with the National Zoo Association that I work for, looking at our members, and yeah, we get that same feedback, particularly from the smaller institutions, where they haven't started because it just looks too daunting. And all I can really say is that it does look daunting until you do it. And as Wendy says, the first one will be a struggle, but once you've done it, you may realise that it's not nearly as difficult as you thought it was going to be. And that's where, if you want to use our tool that's I think still downloadable, you can, welcome to have a go. And that's really the key thing, is just have a go. And once you've had a go, you might hopefully realise that actually it's not as difficult as you thought it was going to be. Interesting question actually in the chat there, asking if anyone's got any experience of getting employees to enter their own data on emissions, similar to the example with the travel emissions. I'm not sure if that's referring particularly to home working or just more generally where people is spread out. But has anyone tried getting people to sort of tell you what perhaps their home energy consumption is related to working? Or?
We've done some for people that are doing home working, where we'll send out sort of a survey. You might not get everyone in the company responding, but hopefully you get a good enough margin that you can understand sort of if they're on renewable tariffs and stuff like this within the business. So a survey like we've done here with just forms can be set up and you can send that round. And then you may need to apportion if you don't get everyone responding, but that can be a very good way to get data.
Mm-hmm.
Just to add in there, similarly, you can do the same for commuting footprint as well, with a poll, and get a statistical sample of where people are coming from if you're computing your commuting footprint. And obviously that can all be done in the same way as we can see a Microsoft form, which are really easy to set up, and I think it's usually for free within your Office 365 setup, that you get that with it, so it's nice and easy to set up and for people to complete.
Out of interest, when you're looking at things like working from home, do you have a way of apportioning it based on whether somebody's home is occupied during the day normally, or versus one that somebody's home might have been empty during the day, and therefore the impact of working from home is bigger, essentially?
Yeah,
Miles?
so within our calculations, we typically look at, this is something you can request on the form, what percentage of the time is other people typically in the home, and mainly we focus on the heating in that essence. We would use less gas, typically none, or an apportioned amount if you have good data. So yeah, mainly on the gas side, and then how we typically calculate the electricity is based on sort of the average laptop, if they have monitors and stuff. So all of these things can be asked. In some cases, we've gone in such detail because the only homework we've asked stuff for, like the wattage of the laptop, they have the wattage of the monitor, so you can go into very granular, or you can keep it more sort of UK average data, which can be used for larger companies.
Okay, we'll post the SBN video. We covered this in. We'll post that in the chat just now, and the time code for that section has all the formula in it, so that you can watch it, at your leisure a bit later.
Yes, so this morning I'm going to talk very kind of quickly about our journey towards our Scope 3 footprint. We've just undertaken our first assessment. It's based upon pre-COVID data, and obviously we've got a fair bit of work to do on it moving forward. So I'm very much going to cover a little bit about Scope 1 and 2 emissions, some of the work we're doing on campus, and then look at our Scope 3 footprint that I've just mentioned. So, sorry, hold on. There we go. So for those of you who don't know anything about us, University of Winchester, we're quite an old university. We're founded in 1840. We've got about 8,500 students, about 900 members of staff. It's a really rapidly growing institution. We're about 77,500 square metres, and that's a 79% increase since the start of our carbon management programme back in 2006. So that's been a massive challenge for us, obviously with a huge growing estate, whilst trying to reduce our carbon footprint. About 45% of the estate is residential, so lots of students living in accommodation. And actually this, or the last reporting year for our carbon footprint, we actually had a 10% increase in the size of the estate in one new building that was bought online, which has been performing reasonably well. So in terms of the carbon management plan, as I said, it's been in place since 2006. We've got a baseline of our originally measured carbon footprint of 4,200 tonnes. We've had some really good reductions in Scope 1, Scope 2, and some elements of Scope 3 emissions that we were measuring. Just to put some figures around it, we spend about £1.8 million a year on energy, and we have been sourcing 100% renewable electricity since 2008. We've got a reasonable amount of on-site PV generation, about 77 megawatt hours a year, which is about 2% of our total demand. But we are currently working through a decarbonisation project and installing more PV, but I'll talk about that in a minute. We've also started procuring 100% of our gas now from renewable sources, from biomethane, and that's been implemented since September 2020. And overall, throughout the kind of period of our carbon management plan, we spent about £2 million on carbon reduction projects. And currently, I'm in the middle of running, or will very shortly be finishing, a £3 million decarbonisation project under the public sector decarbonisation scheme. So just thought I'd briefly mention some of the carbon terminology, and I don't want to teach people to suck eggs, but essentially we are currently measuring our Scope 1 emissions, so fossil fuels, vehicle fuels, refrigerant gases. Scope 2 are indirect emissions, so our electricity that we're using for lighting and running equipment. And we are measuring some of our Scope 3 emissions currently, so water, waste, business travel. We also report our emissions in location-based reporting methodology, so that's based upon the grid factors, and we also report upon market-based emissions using the or getting the benefit from the fact that we currently purchase on our energy on renewable supplies. So some of the areas that we weren't currently measuring in the start of our carbon management plan, though, in that Scope 3 area, are kind of staff and student travel and commuting to campus. And the goods and services, which is a huge area, which I'll talk about later on. So this kind of graphically shows what the university is doing in terms of its kind of measured carbon footprint. So essentially the area within the red box are the areas that we've measured since 2006, and the scope 1 at the top, then obviously the teal band is scope 2, and then the wider scope 3 footprint is there at the bottom. So we're planning to get to net zero by 2025 as an aspiration, particularly from scope 1 and 2 emissions. So we currently deal with those emissions through purchasing REGO certificates and offsetting our fleet emissions via carbon credits. We currently purchase 100% renewable power for all electricity to deal with those, and then we are also purchasing carbon credits and offsets via the Carbon Coalition, which I'll talk about later on. But obviously we've got this whole area of scope 3 at the bottom that is currently sits outside our footprint, and we're kind of working on a plan to improve data quality and how we're going to deal with those emissions in the future. So in terms of our scope 1 and 2 emissions, as I said, we've got this net zero target by 2030, but we aspire to get there by 2025. Arguably, you could say that we've already achieved that, particularly from scope 1 and 2. So our location-based energy emissions, i.e. the ones using the grid factors, we've had a 66% reduction relative to the size of the estate and a 40% reduction overall. And taking into account the fact that we're purchasing renewable energy, we've pretty much hit net zero bar our fleet emissions, or few remaining fleet emissions that we have. So obviously there's big carbon impact between buying renewable and buying non-renewable sources in terms of scope 1 and 2. And you can see the difference there. So you can see there in 2008, we've started to purchase green electricity, and obviously that halved our carbon footprint overnight. And then since 2019, we've been purchasing green gas. So you can see there at the bottom in purple, our emissions have dropped quite dramatically. So we're currently in the middle of a large-scale decarbonisation project. This was a PSDS funded project that focuses on degasification. It's a £1 billion government fund that was released post-COVID to kind of stimulate the green economy. We were in the right place at the right time. We applied for £3 million, and we were lucky to receive that grant. So the money has to be spent in the next 13 days. So we've got a fair bit of work to do before the end of March. Essentially, we're installing 34 air source heat pumps on a number of our large buildings across campus. We've increased the size of our solar PV by around 300%, and we're doing some building management system installations and LED upgrades as well. And the project is going to guarantee us, the contractor is essentially it's an energy performance contract, and the contractor is going to guarantee us £68,000 in energy savings and around 484 tons of CO2 based upon grid factors. But the elephant in the room is our scope 3 footprint. So we've been looking, as you know, we've done some scope 3 work over since the start of our carbon management programme, but we decided it was time to start really looking at our scope 3 emissions and understanding the scale of the problem. It certainly it is certainly a big problem for us. So our first pass at our carbon footprint, this was based upon the 2018-2019 academic year. So this was pre-COVID. And we kind of discovered that scope 3 is actually 95% of our total carbon footprint, which was quite staggering given all the work we've done on carbon over the years. So our total carbon footprint for that year was 22,000 tonnes. And of that, those kind of scope 1 emissions were about 5%. So it was a huge issue for us moving forwards. So obviously we've got this target to get to net zero, but obviously we're going to have to look at avoiding those emissions in the first place, removing them where we can, and then there will obviously be some form of offsetting via carbon capture and storage, sequestration, or offsets in the traditional sense. So how is that scope 3 footprint broken down? So the big chunk of that, 46%, is the kind of stuff that we buy. Around 30%, based upon the estimates and the data that we had at the time, was based around employee commuting. And that's something we're doing a large amount of work on at the moment. We're just revisiting our travel survey to see how travel has changed, particularly as a result of the pandemic, and to kind of improve our data quality around commuting data for staff and students. And then the other big chunk there is the kind of capital goods, furnishing, stationery, computer and software. So we have joined the Environment Association of University and Colleges. They have a kind of coalition of universities that have come together to improve data quality around Scope 3, work out ways of measuring Scope 3 emissions that specific to universities. And essentially it is kind of like a group buy scheme for universities to be able to purchase offsets as a group. And obviously try and receive some kind of cash saving there. And the graph here on the right hand side shows you the different types of offsets that are available in terms of cost and in terms of permanence, and whether they're going to be kind of good quality offsets in the future. So for that 2019-20 academic year, we purchased 386 tonnes of CO2, and that basically offset the carbon footprint that we were measuring originally. So you could say that we are now carbon neutral for scopes 1 and 2, plus that business travel, waste and water footprint. We split the purchasing of those scope 3 credits by, we did 50% UK forest carbon codes and 50% was a kind of carbon coalition portfolio. So essentially they purchased a large quantity of different offsets that had been through a peer-reviewed process, working in a university. Quite often academic members of staff who, from an academic perspective will have quite a lot to say, and certainly universities have a huge amount of expertise in these areas. So that peer review process for the Carbon Coalition was really, really important. And then just finally to finish up, obviously what we're going to be looking at moving forwards in terms of our scope 3, we're obviously going to be feeding into this carbon coalition. We're going to be working on improving the accuracy of our data. We had a new finance system that was brought in a few years ago that we thought was going to be the kind of panacea to sorting out all of our data issues around scope 3. Hasn't quite worked out that way, so we've got a fair amount of work to do still in improving data quality, particularly from that finance system. So we're currently looking at those high spend areas and the kind of biggest suppliers which we can work with to kind of measure and improve data from those suppliers within our procurement chain. Ensuring that we make sure that carbon is thought about at that procurement stage as well. So when we're running tenders, are we purchasing goods that have a low carbon footprint, or are we purchasing from companies that have made a commitment to reduce the carbon footprint of the goods and services they provide? And then finally, kind of around the commuting and home working, obviously there's been some huge changes around, in particularly for COVID for staff and home working. I think Wendy mentioned that earlier, but particularly in terms of students as well, we're seeing a bit more of a shift to students studying and living at home rather than staying at the university or staying within the city. And of course, longer term, that could have quite a big impact in terms of our scope 3 footprint. So I think that brings me on to my last slide. Those are my contact details if anybody wants to get in touch and discuss further.
Just a couple of questions coming in on the chat, and I sort of spotted, thought about this myself. And there's green gas to start with. You mentioned you're now 100% biomethane. My gas supply at home is supposedly carbon neutral through a mixture of biomethane injection and then some offset. How is your supplier guaranteeing that you're 100% biomethane as opposed to an offset? And how does that? How comfortable are you about that, claiming that as net zero?
I mean, like I say, my personal view is in terms of claiming net zero. My view is that we should just be moving away from gas entirely, and that is obviously part of the focus of that decarbonisation project, moving to heat pumps. It's absolutely not a long-term viable solution, as it says there, to meet net zero.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. And then the other question is about, on your graph of different types of offset and different quality, it mentioned mineralization and direct air capture and storage. As far as I'm aware, those are both experimental technologies. They're not deployed at scale yet. So are those just on the graph as a future plan, or are they something that they're actually investing in?
Yeah, that graph actually comes from the Carbon Coalition. So they're obviously, from an academic perspective, looking at those technologies for the future. Right. Of course, in terms of cost, when those technologies become viable, the cost is going to be absolutely astronomical.
Yeah, right.
Could
so
I
at the moment, any offsets they're buying are what's available on the market now. Then.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Could I just add in a point about availability now? It's spot on with that. Even things like the Forest Carbon Code, actually availability, there is very, very, very little. Yeah. And price-wise, we know these things have shot up in the same way that energy markets have. There's been a recent lack of availability of new credits. That coupled with COP26 and all the other pressures, and to be honest, the cheaper projects have been done now and we're moving on, has really forced the pressure up on offset. So I think you're very lucky these days to find anything much under £10 per tonne, and that it would be your verified carbon standard is about that level at the moment for those various reasons. So carbon finances will tell us that this is the market actually working properly, and this is the true value of those things, whereas the market has been too low and hardly being able to finance the continuation of those projects. So maybe that is a good thing in that way.
Yeah, I'd definitely argue that £10 a tonne is far too cheap. We're pricing it significantly higher. Just a question about the £1 billion fund. Was that a public sector fund, wasn't it?
Yeah, so it is it's a public sector decarbonisation scheme, so it is only available, for public sector bodies. Whether the government is looking at funding for non-public sector in the future, I'm not sure. There is certainly a lot of talk that there will be further PSDS funds, or the public sector decarbonisation scheme funds. They're on the third phase of that in the last 2 years, so we shall have to wait and see what happens, whether that funding goes outside of the public sector.
Okay, thanks very much. So I'm now going to hand over to Miles from Carbon Footprint, who's going to give us hopefully some detail and background on the Scope 3 accounting.
Yep, let me just load that up. So yeah, what I'm going to run through today is sort of where you can get started and a bit more about what it is and how to do it. That's Scope 3 and also your supply chain. So what we've got here. So we've already discussed the scopes. You've likely done Scope 1 and 2 calculations for some people, and Matt has just discussed them there, but I've got a little slide here just to show the greenhouse gas protocol, which I'm going to be discussing throughout this because they have quite good guidance on Scope 3. So you have your Scope 1 direct emissions there, your Scope 2 that is indirect but still should be reported as it's your electricity usage mainly. And then this graph is quite good this chart, because it also shows the upstream activities and the downstream and how that's split out. So for example, you might have purchased goods were upstream and the transport of them to yourselves may be upstream. And then you have your energy that you've put in would be your Scope 1 and 2. And then the goods may be then shipped downstream to the supplier. So that's just an example of how you may need to capture all your Scope 3 to get a good understanding of, say, a product that you're selling or producing. So a key point is why measure and manage your Scope 3 emissions. So there's a few reasons we have here. We've got mandatory disclosure. There's not too much of this yet, but within the UK we have SECR reporting. So this doesn't too focus on Scope 3, but it does look at some Scope 3 elements. This is for large entities within the UK, and you're looking at some business travel, mainly sort of expense mileage, which we've discussed there, comes into your Scope 3. The other bigger one, although it requires a £5 million contract with the UK government at the moment, is the PPN 0621 guidance. And this actually looks for 5 Scope 3 elements to be recorded and disclosed. So you're looking at your waste, your upstream and then downstream freight, your commuting and business travel. So this is UK government guidance or disclosure for larger companies, but it is quite often a good place to start. So if you've done your Scope 1 and 2 and you're saying, where do I go next for Scope 3? I'll talk about some ways you can do that. But you can always go, okay, this year we're going to try and get in line with PPN. and then you can go to your full from there. So it is a valid route you could take, and that could be a place you'd look. We then also have sort of voluntary disclosure, which I've put in this category, but this is stuff like Carbon Disclosure Project or science-based target initiatives. These typically need you to look at all of your scope 3 emissions, especially if they're significant, typically above sort of 60%, 66% of your emissions. And then there's just the internal understanding. So it's good to identify these hotspots and work with your supply chain and the potential of saving costs and carbon. I have put the link to the PPN document here, and when we share the slides, you should be able to access that because they give a good breakdown on the 5 categories I've said for scope 3, and they say what they are and how to calculate them quite easily there. So the next thing is where to begin. So obviously scope 1 and 2, understand your own footprint before you start looking at your scope 3. And a key point that when I first joined the job at Carbon Footprint, I didn't know. So scope 3 emissions are always someone else's scope 1 and 2 emissions. So your scope 1 and 2 of, say, my earlier example, you've got the packaging coming in, you put in some energy, and then the packaging, say, goes on, if we're looking at a packaging example. Your scope 1 and 2 emissions that you've put the energy in would be, say, the distributor at the end, maybe it's a shop, you would be in their scope 3. So everyone's scope 1 and 2 is someone else's scope 3. So yeah, you need to consider this. And despite this, if in a perfect world, everyone will look at their scope 1 and 2, but it's good to also track your supply chain understanding and drive change, because you are still responsible for other people's scope 1 and 2, because by doing your business, you are sort of contributing to it. So we then have 2 good starting points that I would say, and we work with a lot of our clients on this, and it can be done sort of internally as well. So I'll show them here. So a great place to start is, first of all, a gap analysis. So as I mentioned earlier, the greenhouse gas protocol is a great place to start. I've put the link there, but essentially this document is, I think, hundreds of pages. So it's not the easiest one just to look at and know where to go. So I've given guidance here, go to table 5.4. And what this does is it has all of the categories of scope 3, so all 15. And within these categories, you'll see here that I've got the example. So the first, second, and third example there, they'll tell you what it is. They'll give you a description to give further details. And then they'll also say what in many ways is a minimum boundary. With science-based targets, actually looking at this as sort of a mandatory boundary, that's what you need to cover in order to then disclose and make a science-based target. So this is a great place to start. And then what you can do is, in terms of gap analysis, you look at this. Is it negligible? Do you know that you have operations in this? If so, there's then a lot more places in the guidance you can read to actually get more detail, but this is just your overview and where best to start. So anyone that comes to us saying we want to submit science-based targets, say, we will typically run a program like this. What have you calculated? Have you got these capital goods? Have you covered all of these elements? And we'll run through it with them. But as I say, this is available to everyone. So please do this internally and have a read through. And that table is where we'd suggest to focus. Within the table, once you've then looked at it and you say, OK, so I know what I need to do now, you then need to say, OK, where am I going to get this data from? So I've got a little example here. So we have primary, secondary, and then what I'm deeming tertiary data. And as you see by the arrows at the top, you've got the most accurate data. So you've got your primary data. And then as we go down, the availability may increase, but the accuracy will go down. So in a perfect world, everything will be primary data. But when you go to collect data, you'll see it's not always that easy. So your primary data, you would have sort of exact data. So the example I normally give to people is, say you're producing a plastic bottle and it needs to be injection molded, say, your primary data would be, can you go to your supplier and say, please give us the kilowatt hours or heating or anything used to produce that plastic bottle? And hopefully they can give that to you. If not, you then move to the secondary section. They may not know the exact kilowatt hours, but they may be able to tell you, oh, it's injection molded using this equipment. So then you look at the equipment. Is there a emission factor available that says to injection mold this part is X kilograms? So that's just an example of secondary data. So it's using averages and emission factors there. And then the tertiary data is your cost-based approach, which can be a good place to get sort of a screening or a health check of your supply chain. So that is then coming into sort of option 2, which is the spend-based carbon assessment. Within this, you're using then your cost-based factors to estimate your supply chain emissions. So you're taking your total cost, you're running it through emission factors to identify hotspots. Because what you often find is, although your spend might be largest in a certain area, you may find that the actual emissions from that spend category might be actually very low when compared to a lower amount that may be in sort of a manufacturing section, maybe a lot higher. So it will help you identify where to go. And then also what you can then do from that data is you can identify the hotspots, and then you can focus, okay, so this is where I go for my primary data. This one isn't as important, but if we can get some sort of secondary data, then that would be useful. And what you can start to do is, if you know a supplier's emissions, you can minus off an amount of cost. So all of this cost was this one supplier. You can minus off that cost, so you're no longer using the spend basis in future years. You can focus on the actual data you get from them. So this can just be a way to capture the smaller emissions you can't always get to. And my next slide is then your progression. So year one, you may say, okay, we'll get 100% tertiary data. We'll just do a cost-based assessment. That's all we need for now. We'll work out our key areas. And then year two is then where you focus your primary data collection, your secondary data, once you've identified it. And the best thing about this is you need to start shifting, because often you'll find if you just keep doing a cost-based approach, you might spend a bit more to get a more environmentally efficient product, but the actual spending more is affecting the emissions in this case. So that's why you need to be shifting to the primary data. So it's good initially, but you need to be able to switch to more primary data. And then, as I've got here, obviously these are just loose guidance. You're then starting to work with your suppliers to collect the data. And then once you've got a better understanding, you may be able to even influence them to start doing their own carbon reporting, or you might be able to work with or even transition to different suppliers based on sort of if they can provide data and if their product is more sustainable. So that was a quick run through of a few options you can take. I've got a bit of a recap slide here, which also has some additional benefits. So obviously I've got these points here. So you're identifying hotspots to reduce emissions. It can help you with tenders and becoming or remaining in other people's supply chains. So as say the PPN becomes PPN document for larger companies, they are looking at eventually potentially rolling that down to smaller businesses or pushing that up the supply chain. So it's a good thing to start doing now. And it shows you're going, yeah, have I got here, above and beyond, and showing your environmental understanding and green credentials, show your transparency, make all of this public on your website. Even if you haven't done all of your scope 3, it's good to show what you have done and what you're working towards. So as I got there, there's the aims of the talk, and we have here some further resources, all of what I've discussed here. So PPN guidance, scope 3 guidance, some places where you can get some cost-based emission factors here at the bottom there, and then there's our own website that's linked there and here. And one other thing I will quickly mention before the end, we're actually putting together a white paper on this cost-based screening and how to sort of set targets from there. So if anyone's interested in that, if you're on our mailer, you already received that, or please feel free to get in touch with myself or Wendy and we can add you to the waitlist. So as soon as that's ready, we can send that around to everyone. Yep.
Thank you very much. That's very interesting. And thank you for the links to the sources of data as well. That was about to be one of my questions, actually, was whether the actual data for your initial screening is available on the different categories of products and stuff. Because that's the hardest part. I know there are a lot of commercial databases for carbon intensity on all sorts of different things, but they're relatively expensive to access yourself.
Yeah, so there's some here. So we've got the UK government have some factors that are slightly dated now, but they recommend use of sort of the World Index and ONS data now that has sort of superseded that. So there's some links there to look into that further.
Thank you very much. We had a sort of technical question in the chat that I'm not sure any of the team might be able to answer. Just talking about things like travel, which are an indirect emission, which is classed as scope 3, and then electricity is also an indirect emission, is classed as scope 2. Does anybody know why your indirect emissions are divided into scopes 2 and 3 rather than just being direct and indirect?
From my understanding, it is to make sure that everyone's showing their scope 1 you have, or your scope 2 you have a lot more control of the kilowatt hours. So every business should have electricity you'd expect. So it's sort of getting your scope 1 and 2 helps comparability between other companies. So it's just, yeah, it's always in there. It needs to be shown and compared.
So essentially we've got easy to obtain indirect and hard to obtain indirect.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. That makes more sense. Okay, thank you very much, Miles. Well, just to introduce Katie, she runs a shop in Winchester called the Zero Waste Shop, where they've done some really nice things around just eliminating packaging almost entirely from their retail environment, and looking very hard at their supply chain and using companies who are both obviously minimizing packaging, but also very strong ethical sourcing details in their whole supply chain, from their right from growers and processors and that sort of stuff. So it's if you're anywhere near Winchester, it's very worth a visit.
Lovely. So for anyone who I haven't met before, my name is Katie and I set up Earthian Zero Waste Shop on Parchment Street. We opened in September 2020, which is almost a year and a half ago now, and the shop serves the community and helps it to reduce its household waste. In particular, the products we stock and the shopping experience itself helps to eliminate single-use packaging and plastics from our everyday essentials. Over the first year that our business was trading, we helped to reduce 28,000 pieces of plastic from being needed. However, the goal that I have for the shop is a bit more wide-reaching. I'd like to help shape and support a movement towards the circular economy, being resources are shared, repaired, reused, recycled for as long as possible. I'm aiming for the shop to be zero waste to landfill. Of course, we need to be diverting 99% of our waste away from landfill to achieve this certification. At this point in time, the shop is about 90% diverted, and I have some plans that I'm going to be working on the next couple of months to achieve that last 9 to 10% with the waste that we have remaining. I believe that the shop can provide more than just a retail opportunity. That's what I have as my mission for the business, beyond just being here to sell products. So I take the buying decisions really seriously, and our stock reflects a couple of sustainable goals, from plastic-free packaging to sourcing organic, vegan, natural products. But given the nature of the shop, the focus being around zero waste shopping, I was going to focus on my experience of using closed loop supply chains and working with sustainable suppliers. So the graphic on the right is something that one of my suppliers has provided, and it shows the system quite simply. We have products that are made by UK-based producers. They then transport the products using their own fleet to me at the shop, where customers bring their own containers and they refill and reuse here in the shop. When my deliveries come, I have empties here, which I then pass on to the driver. They take them back to the producer and they're reused. So you have this nice cycle where the raw ingredients are coming in, but they are being packaged up using the same containers again and again. I work with 4 suppliers that use this same system, meaning that we have a wide range of products in the shop, not just like this graphic shows. We don't just have liquids, we also have food products that use the same system as well. It works very well on a small scale. We are obviously a very small business, with more just better described as a micro business, because it is just myself and one other member of staff here. I would like to see this kind of system working on a much larger scale, so that reuse becomes the norm in our supply chains. So looking at the suppliers for our cleaning liquids, powders and cooking oils, They were set up for this already. So I chose them because it's their niche. They do it efficiently and sustainably. But I've also been working with local suppliers to try and emulate this system closer to home. I source coffee from the New Forest, and I chose this independent producer because they had other sustainable goals. So excuse me, the Forest Edge Roasting Company uses a solar-powered roaster, and all of their retail packaging is compostable. But when I got in touch about providing it in bulk, I asked if we could have a returnable, refillable system, and it was really refreshing that they came back straight away and had suggestions of how we can make this work. And so from the first day that we started stocking coffee, we had that closed loop supply already in place between myself and the producer in the New Forest. We also have a Hampshire-based supplier for oat milk. It comes from Rushmere Farm in Hambledon. They are practicing regenerative farming, and they're turning the farm from what it was before to becoming completely organic and providing havens for wildlife. And so that was my initial reason for wanting to stock their oat milk. But it was coming as a bag in a box. A 12-litre box like that requires less carbon, less water to produce and recycle than Tetra Paks do, but it was still leaving a plastic bag for myself to recycle here at the shop. And knowing that plastic doesn't recycle well, I was quite keen for us to work for another solution. So I talked to the supplier, and they were amazingly responsive to this. They went away, had a little look at what they could do, and our shop then became the testing ground for a new closed loop system where the milk is bottled at the farm, delivered to me, where I dispense it from a refrigerated box, and then those tubs go back to the farm, and everything is reused in that system. So that's just a little look at some of the ways that this supply chain is being used in a small scale locally, and how people have been really adaptable and thinking about ways we can reduce our waste in this chain. Could we go to the next slide, please? I thought it might be helpful to look a little bit at the challenges. I only wanted to briefly look at challenges because our business model was set up specifically for this kind of supply. So we haven't come across many challenges. Most things were ironed out early on because it was our intention from the beginning. But what we are trying to emulate is the shopping experience. So in the same way that a customer comes in with their own container from home, they weigh it, fill it, and take it back. They're filling and refilling time again. I would like to be able to have containers, larger containers, that our suppliers fill and refill for us, so that on the retail side of things, we are hugely reducing the packaging and the waste that is created from passing on products to people's households in the local area. And the problems with that are mainly sanitation and security. The tubs are being used again and again, and they do suffer wear and tear in transit. When I open them here at the shop, of course, the seals are broken, and I'm sure most people will be able to extrapolate from that what issues you might have when you're dealing with food and chemicals. So we have suppliers that are set up for this, as I say, so they do most of the sanitizing and cleaning at their end, but they do expect us to look after the containers, rinse them. We're not allowed to alter them because they're essentially on loan. They don't belong to me, they belong to the producer. So some of the other obstacles that we have are space. So we have to store them all until the next collection, but we might, with one of our suppliers, they expect us to save up quite a few before they will take them all back, because for them that saves the number of trips that they're making. So they're trying to think of how to collect all these empties in a more efficient and sustainable way. But we also have to be careful about mixing, so we're not allowed to change the purpose of any of the containers, because that might lead to contamination between different chemicals and between chemicals and food. One of the other things that I was asked to talk about today was how I choose my suppliers. So most of the time that I'm not running the shop, I spend it on research. It's something that I quite enjoy, but it also serves the shop quite well because I have a selection of trusted suppliers that I use. There are 4 things that interest me when I'm trying to source something new. That is the company structure, packaging, ingredients, and end of life. One of the places that I go to find out more, and I thought it might be interesting to share this with people, is I go to Ethical Consumer. Many of you might have already used them or know of them, but it's a great resource because they investigate companies and give them a rating for environmental, ethical, and social standards. So for me, it provides quite a good starting point because it gives me an idea of where these companies sit in the sustainable market. It isn't easy to find suppliers who are willing to make significant changes to their practices, certainly when you're looking at the established supply chain, and that's completely understandable, but it's one of the reasons why I tend to look for smaller companies. I tend to look for local or independently owned or maybe cooperatives. The reason for this is that there aren't any hidden inconsistencies there. So there are companies that may claim high environmental standards for their products, but then they sit under larger umbrella companies that maybe don't share the same values. It's not uncommon to find that, but it's something that I try to be aware of and make sure that I'm avoiding that as much as possible. The second thing I look at is packaging. Of course, that is a huge focus for us at the shop. But it's not just packaging for the products, it's packaging for deliveries as well. So I'm looking at how our suppliers are dealing with packaging in their warehouses, in their factories, and also how they put together their orders for me and how it arrives with me at the shop. Because the whole way along with that, you can have packaging that the consumer, the customer, won't even see or have any knowledge of, but I am aware that it's something that I should be thinking about and looking at. I have had orders where things have come wrapped in a lot of unnecessary packaging, and I tend to just not use those companies again. I will also get in touch with them and let them know and try and share best practice. Probably makes me sound like a bit of a nightmare that I will go getting in touch with people and hounding them, but it's always done with kindness. And for me, I believe it's not about closing the door completely, but trying to encourage changes above me and above the shop. So thirdly is ingredients. It's quite an important area, and I try and stock products that are vegan, cruelty-free, free from parabens, sulfates, and other nasty chemicals. Keen, as I said before, to support organic and regenerative farming wherever possible. And I'm developing quite a bit of knowledge in this area, so I'm currently looking at palm oil and any other ingredients which is linked to unsustainable land conversion and deforestation, and trying to replace products in the shop with others that don't have these ingredients. So lastly, and probably a little bit more relevant to what we're talking about today, is end of life. I do look quite carefully at the end of life of the products and the packaging that they come in, because it isn't possible for everyone to compost at home. As someone, I live in a top flat and I know this problem quite well. So composting is only a solution if you do have access to outside space or maybe public composting sites. So the packaging solutions that I tend to go for are either no packaging at all or recyclable packaging, and compostable is more a secondary consideration if there isn't a better option. So I am looking forward to growing our range of products over the next year, and refill options are becoming more readily available. However, I'm also hoping to find more of these converting to closed loop systems, as without the return and refill option, it is simply buying in bulk to reduce packaging at the consumer end. I do firmly believe that consumers are already doing a lot. They're very aware of what the problems are. So it's for businesses like myself and the suppliers that I use to find better solutions on the levels above. I am also looking at ways we can reduce our carbon footprint at the shop, not just looking at our waste footprint. So we are already a carbon positive workforce. So I offset a little more than our staff team's carbon footprint. We plant trees and we fund sustainable developments using a third party carbon offsetting company. We also source our electricity from 100% renewable sources. And I'm aware that there's lots of other things that we could be doing. And so I found the talks today quite enlightening for things that I should be looking at in the future and what we should be trying to achieve. It's also going to be about adapting to the challenges over the next few years. Our suppliers are mostly small scale, as I mentioned, and they are experiencing huge rises in costs. So fuel and energy, delivery, ingredients, wages, it's all going up and being passed on. So these small suppliers are, in my opinion, pioneering, and they are leading the charge in the circular economy. So I hope to be able to continue supporting them and finding more of them and driving that kind of change, so that this movement isn't lost to those increasing costs for small companies. So that's all I wanted to talk about today, was to just look a little bit at what we do here at the shop, how we look at the supply chain. It is mainly focusing on waste and packaging, so maybe that leads a little bit into the session that's happening in May. But I also wanted to just say thank you very much for listening, and I hope it's been informative.
Thank you, Katie. Yes, it is very interesting. Yeah, it's a shame I don't live in Winchester, really. Just a question popped up in the chat, just off talking where you've gone back to your suppliers to ask about zero plastic and reuse options. It was asking what the uptake is. Have you had any suppliers who said, "Oh no, we can't possibly do that," and you've had to move away from them, or have most of them been accommodating?
There have certainly been suppliers that haven't been able to accommodate, and I have moved away from them. There's lots of things that I'd love to stock here, but I haven't found closed loop supplies for them yet. So I'm holding off and seeing what becomes available, trying to talk to suppliers, getting in touch with them first to actually ask the question, would they do it? Can they do it? So there are certainly places that I have been to already, and because it's not possible, I haven't moved forward with that, which is a shame. Because it's quite a big focus for the shop, I do tend to hold back if I can't find the right option. I'd rather wait than get something in that's not right. So I'm trying to be selective in that way. And there have also been suppliers who I have started using and found that they're not quite what they say, or they're not what the intentions were. And I have, as I say, I dropped those and politely let them know why and moved on to more sustainable sources. That's
great. No, it's fantastic that you can do that, and actually if you turn a supplier down, you have to let them know, I would supply you, I would source from you, but I can't because you're not quite meeting my standards. Hopefully that's the kind of thing that will nudge people into doing more. We have overrun slightly, so we better call it a day there. Just remind everyone about the feedback if they haven't filled it in already, just before we leave. So yeah, if anyone wants to grab that just before they go, that'd be great. But otherwise, just like to say thank you very much to our speakers, to Katie, to Miles, to Matt, and to Peter. All been very informative this morning, and also to Abby and Xenia for joining in with the carbon chat. I hope everyone's found it useful this morning. And thank you very much. I hope you'll join us for our next event on packaging, and to the Northampton event on transport, and then join us in person if you can in Winchester to talk about electric vehicles and movement.